Hello everybody and welcome to camera class. Today we are going to be doing our intro to camera class. My name is Saxon and we'll get started with the video in about 9 minutes here. It's 5:21 my time. So in about 9 minutes we'll get started. As always, anybody who's watching online, feel free to chat in. And anybody in class, you may just blurt out anytime you have a question or say anything that you need to. So I'll mute myself for now and in about 9 minutes we'll get started. Alright everybody, hello and welcome again. Today is Camera Basics. So today's class we're really going to be talking about you're moving from a smartphone or you're just getting back into photography again after a period of time and you're basically brand new to this. You're stuck in the beginning and we're going to walk through the very basic steps in order to kind of get you off the ground and running with your camera. For everybody online, thanks for joining. My name is Saxon, and then for my students in class today, thanks for coming in. As always, anybody online, chat away with any questions that you have. Anybody in person, just blurt out a question whenever you have it, and I'll answer it on camera. So, to start off, where do you go for help when all else fails with the camera? My first beginning step is to always read your owner's manual. As we were just discussing, you might have a 1,000-page owner's manual that you have, and you might have only got up to page 500 of it so far, but continue to read, continue to work with it. There is almost every answer you could think of in there as far as the practicality of lighting or control of f-stop or control of shutter. That's all based on usage, and as you start playing with your camera, that stuff becomes more apparent. But when you're trying to figure out what buttons mean what and what does what, it's a great way to start. My other recommendation has always been YouTube. I think YouTube is a great resource. If you type in the camera model that you own and type in 5 things you didn't know about XYZ camera, you'll find 100 different videos breaking down your camera. Some will be 4 minutes long. So I've seen some that are an hour long. You can find people that nerd out about these cameras, specifically the model that you own. And then my other favorite resource right now that a customer brought me onto a few months ago is called Imaging Resource. The one with the lines that look like Wi-Fi, that's their podcast. So they actually have it. If you just like camera knowledge and information, you can listen to a bunch of guys talk about cameras, which is a lot of fun. Their website, though, is more of a blog-centered website. So the cool part about that is that if you have questions or others have questions similar to what you're looking at, or maybe you know the answer, you can respond and talk to them as well too. And then last thing too, Canon, Nikon, Sony, the big 3 right now in the photography world, they all have their own website, and not only do they have their own website, but they also have tons of information on there. Nikon is one of my favorites. They do a really good job of breaking down optics on the lenses, how to understand focal length, how to understand the millimeter size, getting a better sense of what aperture really does. And not only do they show you that, but they have images to back all of that up, which I think is really helpful and resourceful. So we take pictures. Where do our pictures go? And make sure you have 2 of them. What I mean by that is our pictures are going to get saved to an SD card. Depending on the camera that you have, that could be a standard SD card, that could be a CF Express card, that could also be a compact flash card, it could also be a micro SD card. So when you're first getting into it, research to see what your camera takes, and make sure you buy something with the appropriate read and write speed. Now for standard photography, for more let's say intro or mid-tier cameras, any SD card that you get should be perfectly fine. If you're having something like maybe a more, let's say, intermediate or advanced camera, then making sure that you buy something with a faster read and write speed is probably a very pertinent, important, or matters. So I definitely would recommend, looking to see what you have as a camera based on then to what you're buying for SD cards, because you can go very extreme with the SD cards. I'd say price-wise, some can range for about $10, $15. Some can go all the way up to $200, $300. If your camera doesn't need the $300 one, don't buy yourself that one. But when I say make sure you have 2, it's not uncommon that when you're using these SD cards, given that they have a copper or brass contact strip at the top, those can become worn out or jaded over time, and with that, when you go to insert them in the camera, they might not read or recognize. So have 2 when you go out on a shoot to ensure that one works and that you have a backup just in case one doesn't go through. Your pictures shouldn't live on your memory card. I had a customer come in today actually who told me that the only place they were saving their pictures was on their SD card. And then he pulled out a book, and he actually had about 19 SD cards inside the book. He wasn't saving them anywhere. Now, I kind of saw that, my shoulders went up a little bit, the hair on my neck stood up. I was like, no, that's not good. And I tried to explain that by doing that, you're putting your photos in jeopardy. You're allowing them to possibly be lost forever, given the fact that the SD card is a fragile piece, and therefore, if anything were to go wrong with that, the chances of recovering the images could be slim to none, depending on what you're using and what the program is. Now, I know, as I was told earlier, too, from the week, that SanDisk has their recovery program, which is great, but some other SD cards might not have that, and depending on what you're getting or what you're using, it's better to be safe than sorry. So your picture should never live on your memory card. The memory card should be a way to transport your images from your camera to your computer. And my best process for that is this. So first things always first, turn your camera off completely and wait at least 5 seconds. By doing this, what you're allowing for is that the camera properly shuts itself down and all of the interior parts of it slowly power down too. What I usually recommend for a lot of people who don't understand that is take pictures, and then when you turn your camera off, turn it off and hold it next to your ear. What you'll notice is that you'll hear the sounds and everything on the inside start to power down slowly. Everything seems like it's releasing. And what that is that the camera is finalizing your last images, saving everything, and then safely turning itself off, not to damage or disrupt any of its sensors or light reading or any of the other parts that go into it. So, important thing I recommend doing. Then you want to remove the card from the camera. Place that into a card reader. Now, I always say this to try to avoid using your camera to transfer photos to your device. And the reason I say this is because it's the rule of having too much clutter on your desk when you're doing things. If you have kids, dogs, maybe you have a water bottle, maybe you're having lunch while you're working on your camera, or maybe you just have the camera strap dangling off the table while you're doing all this stuff. You're putting your camera at risk for being damaged, and in my opinion, if you damage an SD card, it's a lot easier to replace that than have to reinvest $1,000 or thousands of dollars into a new camera and gear. So try to avoid using the camera to transfer the photos unless you need to. Much preferably remove the SD card, insert that into an SD card reader, and then allow for the photos to be downloaded that way. Examples of card readers. So you can get any card reader out there. I don't really have one or another that I love more than anything else. I do love this one that we currently sell here in the store, and the only reason being is that in the trifecta, for anybody watching online, the one that's second from the left, is because it ends in USB and USB-C. So depending on the computer that you're at, and I believe it only costs like $15 or $20, depending where you're at, if you have the newer computers like the newer Macs or some of the newer Lenovo's, then you'll see that they have the USB-C. Some of the older computers, maybe your old desktop or your old tower, maybe an older MacBook or what have you, those will have the regular USB-A on there. So I like that because it's very slim, it looks like a thumb drive, and you can kind of put it wherever you need to put it. The other readers are fine, there's nothing wrong with them, they're just more complex, advanced, and usually with more complexity comes more expense. So this is one of those areas where you don't necessarily have to break the bank on a card reader, but having a sturdy, firm one is definitely a good way to go, and I trust brands like ProMaster, Sony, even SanDisk. Apple makes some card readers to work for your phone, your iPad, your Mac. All those are good options. Now, the next step of there is when we're taking the photos off the camera and moving them to the computer. The first thing I want to say is don't move the photos, you want to copy them. And you copy them to a destination folder. The reason that we're doing this is, let's say that during that move process our SD card became disconnected. If we're physically moving the photos from one to the other, if that card comes disconnected, there's a possibility we'll lose our photos. So by making a duplicate copy onto the computer, we're not losing image quality, we're not reducing the files at all, but we're ensuring that if something does go wrong, we can go back to our SD card in order to get those images off. If we're using a Windows computer, we're going to be using the Application Explorer to look through that SD card, and if we're using MacBook or Apple, we're going to be using Finder to find those images. Now, once you've moved them onto the computer and once you've copied them onto the computer, computer, I should say, we want to copy photos to a second place. This is where I would recommend having one of the three objects, having either, there's two different ones I would recommend. Either have an external hard drive of some sort, or have a cloud-based solution. So what I mean by that is that once you have all your images on your computer, that's a great first place to have them, but you want to make sure you have backups to your image, again, in case anything were to get lost or damaged at any point in time. So I like the external hard drive because I like having a tangible item. I have two external hard drives at home. One of them sits by my computer, and the other one I actually keep locked in a safe underneath my bed just in case, God forbid, the house burnt down or something were to happen. I have about 20 years of artwork on there, and I would really be devastated to lose any of that. Now, you can use cloud-based solutions. Something like Prime Photos or Google Drive are my top two options on this slide. Both are great. If you have an Amazon account, you already have access to Prime Photos, which I'm almost positive is pretty much unlimited. Google Drive is a little bit different. Those you get, I believe, maybe 8 to 16 gigabytes your first go around. After that, then you pay for additional storage. But it's a great way for you to have your photos available anywhere to you in the world that you may be. So if you're in London taking photos and you only have access to a computer, rather than worrying about, where am I saving my photos, where are they going, you could just put them on the cloud, and then when you get back to the States or wherever you're from, you'll be able to access those photos again. Last steps on this: eject the card before physically removing it. Always do this. It's the same reason that we turn the camera off and wait about 5 seconds there. It's to make sure that everything powers down, everything is done moving, and that there's nothing else that could possibly get damaged or go wrong in between. Then the last thing on there is format card in the camera. Formatting will erase old info on the card. You can also still delete them while still in the computer. My only hesitation with that is, let's say you're switching between maybe a camera or two. Maybe you have a point and shoot in DSLR, or maybe you have an action camera and a mirrorless camera, or you fly a drone and you also shoot with a camcorder. Each of those products have different formats or have different ways of being formatted. So what I like to recommend is putting that card back into the camera. You can then format the card inside the camera. That will then delete or erase all the old info, and then whatever you're shooting with, you're able to optimize your storage on the physical card. On the flip side of that, once you move that card into another camera, you can reformat the card inside that camera without damaging the card or anything else, and then you're able to now optimize your shooting performance on that physical unit.
Question?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm one of those, I've never formatted any of my cards. I don't know what it does to it. What I do is I do back it up, and I do save that, because there are times that wherever it is, and it's happened to my sister, sometimes something happens to your computer, and yes, that's why you have the secondary. But is there anything that happens if you decide not to format?
Not necessarily. You're not really risking anything on there, and at least in my experience, because I've done plenty of tests where I've bought SD cards, never formatted them, just to kind of see what happens and what happens. In my experience, if you're shooting photo or video, and let's say that the card is optimized, let's say a 64 gigabyte SD card saves 8,000 photos on a 24 megapixel camera, maybe for whatever reason, because you're not formatted, you only get 7,500. Or maybe instead of getting that full 2-hour video, now you can only shoot for an hour and a half. And that's only because the SD card wasn't formatted to work with whatever the camera's operating system was. So that's usually my recommendation with it, is that to get the full usage out of the card, format it so that it has the optimal storage on there. But if you don't format it, I don't think it's going to really do any harm to the card, to your camera, or to the images or videos that you're getting. Nothing gets diminished, nothing gets,
It just, SD cards have gotten so inexpensive, well, relatively, it has given me one more backup.
Yeah, of course.
And that's why I don't format.
Yeah. At least in my experience, there's no harm in not formatting. My only recommendation to formatting is that way it is optimized for whatever camera that you're using. and you're also still able to remove that, go into another camera, and reformat that card inside that camera. So it doesn't matter how many times you reformat them, they can constantly be reformatted until the card no longer,
But it will erase everything every time.
every time. That's the key. So if you're someone who doesn't want to go through and drag and drop all of that stuff to the trash can while it's plugged into the computer, throw that sucker in the camera, hit the format button, it'll clear everything up, optimize the storage, and then you're ready to go for the next shoot. And then to backtrack on all this, so we start with the SD card. That is the vehicle that will transfer photos from one device to another. That's your first line of defense. Second line of defense then comes to your camera, or to your computer, I should say. The computer then takes the images and will save them onto the desktop, or maybe your files, or maybe inside your photo app, whatever you prefer. From there then you have two other options for the backup. You're either going to go into a hard drive, which is a tangible physical item that can get damaged, but as long as you're taking care of it, it can hold all of your information. Or you're going to go to a cloud-based solution. I use the image of a cloud to kind of show that off. Cloud-based solution, I think on the next slide I talk a little bit more about those. Some of my options that I like for cloud-based solution, Google Drive is probably one of the most famous ones out there right now. So many people use it. I think they're the number one cloud-based next to iCloud. It's between Google and iCloud right now. Below that we have the OneDrive. That's from Microsoft. And if you have Office, or if you're using Outlook for your email, you have access to OneDrive too, and that's free with your email subscription depending on what your work does. And then you have the Adobe Creative Cloud. Now the Adobe Creative Cloud is my personal favorite, and the reason being is because not only do you get a cloud-based solution, but you also then get the access to all the editing software that they have too. You pay monthly, and it's not the cheapest monthly fee if I'm not mistaken. I believe it's about $54 a month if you're doing all of the apps. If there's only maybe one or two apps that you need, I think it drops down to about $20 a month. But you get the cloud-based solution in there too, which is great because on top of that, not only do you have the access to editing and changing your photos or videos, you have your ability to then hang the work up in a virtual gallery. And the gallery then can be viewed by other artists and other people in the profession, which I really like. So if you have a photo that you really like and you're like, honestly, I love this photo, what do people think about it? They can give critiques, so they can give comments or criticisms on it. And I think for so many artists out there, when I was going through school, and even now when I'm in a gallery, that's one of the things I live for, is hearing what people think about my work, both negatively and positively, because it then helps influence my next decisions for how I want to go about doing something. So a really great way of kind of submersing yourself into an artist community, getting artist tools, but then on top of that too, having the cloud-based solution to save and work on your images. So I like Adobe the most out of all the Creative Cloud, or out of all the cloud-based solutions. So let's go through a tour of your camera. Now, the image that I have for the camera tour on this is a DSLR camera from a few years back. My goal now is to probably update this and to take new photos and start labeling the stuff, but the same rules apply. These buttons you're going to see across the board on multiple different cameras. They're all going to look similar. Even if you're jumping from a DSLR to mirrorless, some of the buttons that were on the DSLR might be a menu system inside the mirrorless camera. They might have also just gotten rid of them completely because there's no need to have that quick switch on the camera. So this is usually where I tell people online in class, look at your camera as we're going through these images and it'll start to make sense. Now the first thing before I start talking about that, I mentioned the term mirrorless and DSLR. Those are two big terms that you're going to hear about in the camera world. The three main types of cameras: point and shoot or bridge, then you've got your DSLR, and then you've got your mirrorless. Now, a DSLR is basically the modern format of an SLR, and an SLR was a simple 35mm camera, wide format camera, but typically you had a canister of film with sprockets on the inside of the camera that would pull the film through as you were taking your images. Light from whatever you're taking a photo of cuts through and bounces off the mirror. That then ricochets through a pentaprism, and then that comes through the optical viewfinder. When you're shooting on the camera, the mirror will pop up stain your image on the back film, and then the sprocket then pulls the film across so that the next set is ready to go. In the DSLR world, you don't have film anymore, so when this bounces up, the image then gets burnt into the sensor, and we're then able to see the image on the back end of the screen. And that's how that would work. Nowadays, we don't really need that anymore. The mirror on there is a little more clunky and heavy, and it wasn't the best for stability or for video. We don't really talk a lot about image stabilization in this class. That's more for advanced photography when we talk about more about videography. But with the mirrorless cameras, there's no mirror on there. The light cuts through to the shutter releases and closes, it hits the image sensor, and through that, when it hits on the shutter, we're able to physically view it on the electronic viewfinder because the camera has, what's the term I'm looking for, digital optics that allow us to go from one point to the other. So where I would say maybe about 7-8 years ago, people were complaining that mirrorless was not nearly as fast or high quality as DSLR, that has really changed, I would say, for about 2-3 years ago. We've really seen the mirrorless cameras have picked up in quality and image quality specifically based on their DSLR counterparts. Where we also see huge changes is that when we look at something that's a DSLR versus a mirrorless, we can see how much smaller the bodies have become. With that being too, how much thinner the bodies have become too, because there's less gear to lug around and then have the image from the front. You can see the mirror on the inside of the Canon camera, the EOS T680, and then you can also see there's the sensor on the Sony Alpha camera below it too. So when we look at the top of our camera, the first thing we'll look at is the video start and stop button. That should be a red button on your camera somewhere. When you're shooting with your camera, you have the ability to press that button and it'll take you right to the videography mode. Most of the time it automatically starts the video too. Power switch is just below that. That's pretty self-explanatory. That's your ability to turn the camera on and off. Shutter release, typically in the camera world, is going to be in the center of the on and off switch. Now, nowadays with some of the DSLR or mirrorless cameras, they're not doing it that way anymore. The shutter button is by itself and the on and off switch might be on the right side of the camera or somewhere a little bit lower and around the dial area. Again, all models are different. Then you have exposure compensation. Exposure compensation has a little box with a white plus symbol and then a black triangle or black minus symbol. And the idea behind that is that if you're playing with your ISO, or let's say you're shooting an automatic and you don't change your ISO, you can up or lower your exposure compensation to bring in a more exposed image or a less exposed image. And exposure really comes down to the light. So in my opinion, exposure compensation and ISO live in two separate categories. But where you're changing ISO and you're noticing graininess on your photo, with your exposure compensation, you should just be noticing that the overall image is becoming lighter or darker by moving that. So it can work in tandem with your ISO, but it also can work as its own separate entity. Your mode dial, in my opinion, is the same thing that drives your car. It's your way of switching from park to drive to neutral or shifting gears. It's the brains of the camera. It controls the basic function of it. Are you shooting automatic? Are you doing a priority setting? Are you doing shutter, manual, aperture, so on and so forth? That's where the mode dial comes in. LV, or live view, is going to be the ability for the camera to switch or toggle between your LCD screen and your viewfinder on there. Now you can shoot between both, but as we were discussing when you first came in, battery life is something to consider with these cameras, and the more modern the camera, the more gizmos, or I would say the more features that are on the inside, and those features can drain your battery faster than others. Live view is a great way of making sure that if you're not someone who likes to use the screen, you prefer to shoot through the viewfinder, keep it on the viewfinder and you have that ability to do so. Perfect, I just wanted to make sure that the slide was still showing there. I had it the other day where I started a class and I realized I never switched over, so everyone online was just looking at my face and they weren't actually seeing my presentation, so triple checking everything. That's what the live view does. Now, below that, you're going to see another dial on the camera, and that's the command dial. The command dial will either control your aperture priority or your shutter priority based on the camera that you're using. And on the flip side of that too, if you are using automatic, then it controls nothing. Every time you move that dial, it'll do absolutely nothing. So depending on which priority you're on, that will then dictate what the command dial will do. There's also another dial on the front of the camera, which I believe we talk about maybe another slide. But regardless, there's two command dials on the camera. We'll just stick with that. One that's in front of the grip and one that's behind the grip. Typically when you're holding the camera, using your thumb you're able to control the one, and using your index you're able to control the other. The one in the front should control your shutter speed depending on the model that you have. The one in the back will control your aperture. If you're shooting in full manual, you'll have control over both of these simultaneously, but if you're only shooting in a shutter or an aperture priority, you're going to be using one or the other. My biggest recommendation for any first-time photographer that has never done this before and they're just getting started, just start with auto. It is very frustrating when you first get a camera to have all these dials, knobs, features on there, and for you to say, I don't understand these. But what becomes a thing is that when you just start to play with full manual without any prior experience, I notice people get frustrated with this and they don't want to use their camera after a period of time. What's the point in doing all this work when I can just point my cell phone at the thing and take a picture? That's one of the joys of shooting with cameras. If you remember the days of shooting with film, trying to make sure that you got your settings right so that the film would turn out the best way possible was half the battle. Understanding the way that light relates to certain objects and how reflection bounces and how depth of field is important when taking pictures of your subject matter, all of that is extremely important. And when you're using auto, the camera takes that all into effect and it does that work for you. So all you have to worry about is taking the physical image. So again, if you're brand new to photography, you've never picked up a camera before and you have no idea what you're doing, start with automatic. You can even start with the program automatic, the P above it. But in my recommendation, start with that green auto. It's the simplest and easiest. Once you shoot on that for a week or so, then eventually you can graduate to the next ones. And that's where we talk about next class too, because then we get away from automatic in the next class. But for now, everything I'm telling you should just pertain to automatic. Now, the mode dial that we're talking about here in the first slide is going to look different on every camera that you buy. This used to be the vintage Canon logo. Canon would put what they called scenes on there. And scenes were also automatic, but they were a little bit fancier. So one was for more nighttime photography, one was for macro, one was for sport, one was for kids, one was for landscape, portrait, no flash, so on and so forth. Some cameras, and I believe this is an example of a Nikon camera. Now I'm getting mixed up. I want to say this is Sony, and then this is Nikon, this is, no, that was like Sony. Regardless, some cameras, no, this is definitely Sony. Some cameras, because they noticed other people were doing this, created what they called scene mode, SCN. And SCN was another version of that too, where instead of having all of your scene modes on the dial there, you could just have the SCN button, and that would do the trick for you. But these are the common dials that you'll see nowadays on the cameras, and for the most part, they all have the same letters or buttons on there. It really comes down to you just learning them. And the ones that I would say you need to learn are these ones right here. So auto or A+ on your camera, might even be IA as well too for some of the Panasonic models. That's intelligent auto. That's auto control over settings and functions of the camera. All you do is frame your composition up on your camera, either through the viewfinder or through the screen, and just take your picture. M is for full manual. That's full manual control over the camera's array of functions. You dictate every last little bit of what your camera is doing, up into the ISO, to the f-stop, to the aperture, to your focus area, even to your, let's say, lighting or exposure compensation, to all of that is being controlled within full manual. A or AV is aperture priority control. That's your camera's ability to just control the aperture with the one command dial that we were talking about a minute ago. S or TV is for your shutter speed priority, and that again is your control over the shutter on the command dial opposite to that, so the one that's located in the front of your camera. So again, sticking with automatic for now, but aperture priority gives you the ability to control just the depth of field of the camera, whatever the aperture number is. So usually you have something that could be as low as about 1.4, 1.2, and usually goes anywhere as high as 32 or 22 are the most common numbers that I've seen. Shutter's priority is going to be the control of how fast that shutter is closing to get your image. Depending on the object's speed, that's where shutter really comes into effect. If you have something that's moving fast, then you want shutter to be maybe a little bit faster. If it's really slow, it might not matter as much. Program, aperture, shutter speed are auto, but everything else is changeable. So you have the ability to leave everything on automatic, just like you've been doing, but with the program one, let's say that you want your focus area to be a little more wide, or you want to be a little more tighter on the focus. Maybe you'd rather switch from JPEG to JPEG fine, or to JPEG small fine. Maybe you wanted to play with your metering or your exposure compensation. That's something that program would give you the ability to do that auto wouldn't. That being said, I still recommend shooting on auto, but if you feel like you're past that but not quite ready to try the other three, the manual, aperture, or shutter priority, then try program. You might enjoy that one because you still get a lot of cool features that you can try out and use and customize. And then B, this is a button that I don't see on many cameras nowadays, but some models, and I have one that I love that has it still. B is a fully customizable setting on the camera, but as long as you're holding the shutter release on the camera, it will stay open. If you're someone who wants to experiment with long exposures, this is where B is one of the coolest ones. So, for example, I have people that really love to do astrophotography. I myself have tried multiple times to take a stab at it with little to no luck, depending on what I'm doing. But if you're doing astrophotography, when you're taking pictures of the moon or the stars, it's really hard sometimes to take a photo that far away and get all the detail. Therefore, leaving or letting the camera stay open, meaning the shutter is open for a very, very long time, let's say 20 to 30 seconds, you're ensuring that you're going to get a much better quality photo with that one, because the longer your shutter remains open, the more light that the camera can take in and capture. The flip side of doing that, though, the longer it stays open, the blurrier it can become depending on either your shakiness or if you have a tripod, monopod, wind, weather conditions. So that's something to keep in mind when using that. Again, scenes, like we were just talking about on the other one, they are the same thing as automatic. There's another automatic mode. The big difference on there is that they specialize in whatever that little shape is. So if you still have that availability on your camera, I definitely would recommend doing a little bit of research on what those shapes mean. You can check out the camera's website and you should be able to get that information. If you don't have those and you just have SCN, then remember that that is the exact same thing as these dials as well. They're just called scene modes. So moving to the side of our camera, we have our flash button. Now, a lot of mirrorless cameras, and only mirrorless cameras, most of the higher end mirrorless, or I'd say mid-tier or more advanced beginner cameras, will not have a flash, because the camera itself can do so well in low light that if it were to put a flash on top of the camera, that wouldn't be powerful enough for you to really read anything on there. So moving over then to a camera that has, or then buying a separate flash that you can put on top of the camera would be better suited for your camera than if it had a pop-up flash. Function underneath. Now that is a button, and I constantly get asked about this button. Function is going to be a button that is fully customizable. So if you're buying a camera and you see an FN button on there, typically the FN button, if you go into the camera's menu system, will allow you to customize that button to whatever it is that you like. So for example, On my camera, I have mine set so I can do my camera to phone photo transfer. It'll automatically open up that pairing mode on my camera, and then I can pull my phone out, open up the app, and start transferring the images. Other things you could do is for metering. Maybe you want to see what the camera is metering the light to be on there, and it'll pull up a little gram for you to see everything. And that's all through the function mode. If, let's say, you want to get to your focusing viewpoints a little bit better, or your targeted areas for what you're focusing in, and you want to then flip through the options, you can switch it to that. So the function button has not necessarily unlimited amounts of what it can be, but by going to your camera's menu system, you can choose and select what you think the best option for function would be. On the flip side of that though, some cameras, including the other one that I own in my collection, the function button takes me right to the menu system, where then I'm able to dictate what my viewing space is, what my color and white balance looks like, what my sharpness and what my RGB levels are. So it gives me access to some of the camera's actual function settings or shooting settings that I don't get to access in the regular menu of the camera. So definitely would recommend playing with that, seeing which one yours is. If it is the one that you can customize, I definitely would recommend playing with that, because it can save yourself 10-15 seconds from trying to go through the menu, where let's say you've got that bird flying in front of your face, you don't have 10-15 seconds to take that image. So the next thing down, we'll talk about the zoom ring. That's on the front of the lens. Now depending on the lens that you have, you might not have this. For example, you have a 50mm lens, so yours is a fixed lens, so you would not get a zoom ring. Whereas with you, I can't see it from here, but I can tell by the length of that lens, that's a zoom lens. You will have that same thing. And you actually have a button on there that I'll talk about in a second, because I saw it. That's the lens retract button. But before I jump to that one, zoom ring does exactly what it says. If you've got an 18 to 55mm lens like this does, you can go from an 18, which is more wide angle, into 55, which gives you a tighter, narrower perspective of view. That's going to be better for portraits, where let's say that 18 to 24 is better for wide angle. It's better for buildings or landscape, something that you're trying to capture everything. The focus ring on the front dictates the camera's ability to focus. Now, DSLRs, mirrorless, they have this beautiful ability to autofocus for us, and that's a trend I noticed that most people use unless you're doing more cinematography. If you're filming video, it's highly recommended to use your manual focus on there. Only reason being is that as things move back and forth and are kind of in the subject of what you're filming, it might be better for you to readjust that ring ever so slightly, so that way it helps the clarity of who you're focusing in on. For most photographers though, I would say autofocus is what they're using, unless you're very old school and traditional. Now that lens retract button, you're not going to see that on every single lens. It's actually basically going away for the most part, but on some lenses you're going to have that. Now, I have a lot of customers, when they first buy that lens or get a lens like that, they think it's broken. They don't understand why it does that. And that might just be because the lens that you currently have doesn't necessarily have the CPU and the AI systems on the inside, where it can automatically, or it starts to help itself be less malleable. It's pretty movable and pretty easy to move when you're using that zoom ring. So they have a way of locking that lens so that it can't move while you're traveling or while you're doing stuff. So it's a safety measure on the lens to help prevent anything from breaking on the inside of the lens. Below that, and on the physical body of the camera, we now have the lens release button. Pretty self-explanatory. Hold the button down, turn the lens counterclockwise, and then you can release the lens off. You can then insert another lens, turn it clockwise, you'll hear a click, and that's how you know that the lens is now attached to the physical bayonet system of the camera. Below that is then the drive mode button. The drive mode button is going to be the camera's ability to choose what mode you're driving in. So that can be summed up in a few different ones. You'll have a timer on there, and that's what that little circle with the arrow or line pointing out to the side is. Let's say you have the camera set up on a tripod, you want to take a picture with the family, you don't have a remote or anything, or your cell phone's not around, so you can't remote control the camera. You could go to the timer drive mode button, set it for 10 seconds, hit the button, run into place, and then get in front of the camera for your picture. You can also switch so that way it goes from single photos to burst photos. So if you want to take, let's say, the hummingbird that's flying across your patio, you can then take 10, 15 frames a second versus one image a second. That's a really nice feature, especially if you're capturing motion. As I've learned from my years of photography, the faster or more in motion the object is, the harder it is to get a clean photo. So just by taking a couple different images or having the ability to take 10 in a second, there's a more likely chance of you getting one image perfect out of that 10. I also always think, I grew up in the 90s, so I think of those skateboarding magazines where you'd see Tony Hawk coming out of like a half pipe and it would be like 9 images stacked on top of each other. That was what they were using with their camera too. So it could also be a creative choice for what you're doing with that. But it's super helpful and it's really nice, especially with things in motion. Now on the back of the camera we have our menu button. Menu takes you into the advanced settings of the camera so you can change or play with certain features on the camera. Diameter is going to be the ability to change your viewing on the view glass of the physical camera. I like to think of this as when you go to the eye doctors and they put you in front of those things and they put one down and they say, what's better, 1 or 2? 1 or 2. It's the same thing with the diameter. You're changing that so that way when you look through the viewfinder of the camera, it's the most optimized to your eyes. Now, I personally get asked this too. I wear contacts right now, but I'm typically also a 4 eyes person. Do I look through the viewfinder with my glasses on or off? It really depends on where I'm at, but I will say if I am looking through the viewfinder with my glasses on and I then take them off because I'm getting a bad glare through them, I have to readjust my diameter every time. So be aware of that. If you like to use your glasses or you have glasses, you can still look through the viewfinder and it's not going to hurt your image, but if it doesn't look right, adjust the diameter. If you don't like that and you want the suction cup of the viewfinder to be on your eyes to help block out the light, then make sure you have your diameter adjusted for that so that you get the best clarity of view. The info button underneath that is one of my favorite buttons on the camera. I love the info button. And I use this as a huge training tool for all my customers and photo people, anybody I talk to. I think the info button's the best. Reason being is that, I'm going to jump a couple buttons here. If you look at the image playback button, which is the square with a triangle in it, that's how you can view the images that you just took. Let's say you're shooting in automatic your entire life and you say that you got the best photo you've ever seen. And you're like, well, the lighting was like this and my subject wasn't moving. You can press the info button and it'll actually break down what the camera did to take that picture. It'll show you its shutter speed, its ISO, and its f-stop. It'll also give you a little histogram on there too to break down how the light changes and everything else. And again, we don't talk about histograms in this class, it's a little advanced. That'll be in the advanced photography class where I break that histogram down. But what's cool about the info button is that if you are just starting to get into photography and you don't understand what the camera's doing and you want a better understanding of how it's choosing those numbers, info gives you that ability to do so. So I definitely recommend playing with that button. Focus and exposure lock. If you're taking pictures, and my best example I would say would be the I think the way I worded this before is, you've got student picture day at school, and when the photographer comes in, they set their camera up on one tripod, they have it pointed towards a colored background, and they basically just schlep kids one after the other to sit on a bench and get lined up for the photo. When they do that, they typically will press the focus and exposure lock on there, so that way wherever they are focusing on, whatever the main subject of that is, that's where they're going to focus every single time, and they don't necessarily need to change or update that because they're going to plop a kid right in the same exact spot. Same thing if, let's say, you're doing maybe eBay selling or you have an online business. If you make a little setup on your desk to take a photo shoot with, you can then focus and exposure lock yourself so that way you can just change whatever the item is in the front of the camera and you don't have to physically change all your settings on the camera. So that's a really nice feature that I like depending on the subject that you're doing and depending on what it is you're trying to take pictures of. The I button is very similar to the function button. in the sense that the I button on a lot of cameras will be your way of changing certain settings on there. That could be your focus area, that could be your ISO, that could be your image quality, that could be a multitude of other things. So on some cameras you'll notice that the FN button will do that. On other buttons, the I button will do that as well. It could also take you into another menu system similar to the regular menu button. Underneath that, we have the multi-selector, which is pretty self-explanatory. That's your ability to move towards other images and whatnot. And then you have the OK button, so that's your way of selecting and finalizing or just pressing OK on the camera. Underneath that, you'll have a demagnifier and a magnifier button. That's going to be your way to zoom in and check things. So what I usually recommend is when you're taking photos, if you really want to ensure that the quality is there and that nothing was blurry or out of focus, hit the playback button, use the multi-selector until you get to the image, and then magnify in on the image. That'll give you an ability to really get down into the photo itself and see what the quality of the image looked like to make sure you got the best. And then the delete button. I rarely use the delete button. It's probably the one that's used the least on my camera. I don't believe in deleting photos off the camera. I just do that on the computer or when I format the card. Another thing that takes up battery life and will slowly eat away at the amount of time you have to shoot with your camera, depending on what you're shooting. So I don't use the delete button, but it's pretty self-explanatory. Now this is my favorite. I actually had a customer send this to me. My camera doesn't work. If you're taking pictures like this and you just bought a brand new camera, it is most likely not it's not the bat, it's the baseball player. Again, don't shoot in manual, don't shoot in aperture priority, don't shoot in shutter priority until you have a better understanding of what it is those settings are doing. Stick to automatic, and if things still aren't looking right, that's where you need to take some time to think about it. Is my lighting right? If this is an image that I'm getting from a customer, the bar is dark, the cocktail that she's holding is dark. There's a little bit of light on her hand, but overall, again, there's something that's not quite right. It's probably not the bat, it's the baseball player. Now, the next thing I always like to say is that your camera isn't your smartphone. We live in a great day and age where if you really want to take a picture of something, you've got a cell phone in your pocket, even if it's a flip phone, and it has a camera on there. And that's great. But there are some things that your camera is going to do that your smartphone won't, and vice versa. There's going to be things that the smartphone does that your camera won't. Give it time, practice with it, play with it. Overall, the reason you invested in a camera and even wanted to shoot on a camera was either because you remember doing it with film, or, as a lot of people I notice have seen, they see the images their phone are taking and they sit there and they go, there must be something better. And that's what the camera really comes into, but you're not going to notice it until you really start to become more comfortable with the camera to the point where you understand how to control the knobs and the dials to really get everything either into the focus that you want it to be, the clarity, the depth of field, again, all the same things we're talking about this whole class. That's the whole push. So again, your camera isn't a smartphone. Now this one might seem pretty self-explanatory, but I see a lot of people doing it and I feel like it must be talked about, and the intro class is the best part to do this. As an artist, as someone who plays with cameras, as someone like myself who paints and draws on a regular basis, carpal tunnel, arthritis, and bad back problems are in my future, and I can already feel them in my knuckles. Do the best that you can to keep your body safe so you can continue to do this for a long time. When you wing it with your elbows out to the side, you're not necessarily hurting yourself, but you're allowing for bad things to happen if someone bumps or hits you and you have the camera in your hand. You can talk about not getting a steady shot, but when you really look at that image, number one, he looks awkward and not in control of his full movements, but number two, he's leaving himself vulnerable to be bumped or for anything bad to happen, as well too, your arms get shaky. I consider this to be your support beams with the camera. And I think about, like, if you go home and you've got a deck or a balcony, usually the balcony comes out to a certain point and there's bars or supports coming from the wall to the balcony to give it support to stay. That's what your arms are doing in this case. Your arms are lodging themselves into your stomach or your chest area, and they're basically forming a kind of angle that you're holding onto the camera with. So when I'm shooting, I typically will shoot more like this, where my arms are in to keep myself not vulnerable, but then also to jam them into my sides so that way I can hold the camera better and get less shake. You can see she keeps her arms a little bit further off on this image, but when she gets to this image, her arms are nice and tight into her body, giving her that extra bit of stabilization. Same thing with this gentleman. He has one arm more positioned underneath him, and the other arm is kind of off to the side a little bit. And that's totally fine, but he's keeping himself narrow in order to get that image. Last thing too, I would say, is watch your back. Again, it's one thing to do it a couple times here and there, but if you're constantly taking pictures like this, your lower back, your upper back's gonna hurt. But then on top of that too, neither of the cameras that you have are light. Maybe the point and shoot model is, but they're not light cameras. So they have weight, they've got weight to them, and that is just gonna slowly start to eat away at your upper and lower back. So definitely keep posture when you're shooting as best as possible. If you can, dip lower with it. I know it's not easy on the knees, but if there's a way for you to get the image safer, then rather than have to do all these crazy contortionist shapes, try to do it. It will help in the long run of things. Focus, then shoot, and shoot through the picture. So I get a lot of people that they'll focus and they'll be like, I'm looking through this and I just like how the way the Apple Store looks. I don't care about anything else. And that's great, but when you focus on only one aspect of the photo while everything else is in focus, you're going to start to lose things and you're going to start to get bad photos. If you can focus on the entirety of your image square, that's why we have a little viewfinder on the camera. That's why we have a screen. And that's why nowadays, compared to film, we have the instant gratification of knowing this is what my image looks like right after I shot it. Focus on the whole thing, shoot, and shoot through the entirety of the image, not just one section of this or not just the lighting of that. You want to make sure you're looking at the whole image. We can always edit, we can always crop, and we can always change things later on, but we can't make an image look better or look less blurry or look, XYZ in post. If you or the camera are moving, you will get blurry photos. Now, there are plenty of artists that have made a business on shooting blurry photos on purpose, but I imagine that the two of you that are sitting here and everyone online, that is not what your goal is. Your goal is to get the most clear and best photo of whatever it is that you're doing, whether that be vacation, whether that be work, whether that's the kids, the grandkids, the wife, the cousins, the family, whoever you're trying to take a picture of, you want them to look like them as best as possible. So make sure that you slow yourself down, because if you're moving or the camera moves, you're going to get blurry photos. And if that's not the intention, then you just have to check yourself on that a little bit. Now, these are my rules for the basics of taking great photos. I'm going to say this at the beginning. All rules are meant to be broken. Don't follow them to a T. But this is what I have learned through my schooling and through everything else, and even my own just regular photo practice to take good photos the first go around. So rule one that I tell people about is to fill the frame. I'm going to throw terms out there too, art-related terms. This is how you'll hear things commonly referred to when you're looking at it. So around our model here, we have negative space. We can also call it dead space too. Negative and dead space just means that it doesn't add anything to our positive or to our regular, whatever the photo center is that we need it to. So in this case, we have shadow coming from the wall where the molding stops. We also have the molding on the bottom here that we can see clearly, and we can even see where the ceiling and the actual wall then touch. We don't need any of that. If this is just a regular headshot for us to send in for either a job application or maybe for an acting profile, or maybe we just want to update our Facebook, this is going to be a more satisfying image. Why? Because the main subject of what we're looking at is our model in the center, or is the person. So we're cutting out the garbage, we're cropping in, and we're focusing in on the main part of the photo. Eyes in the top third of the photo. If we look at the last photo that we were just looking at, if we break her into 3 different sections, we can notice that her eyes, for the most part, are in the top or are on that line. Same thing with the gentleman on the next photo. His eyes are closer to the top third of the photo versus the bottom of the photo. As humans, we're creatures of habit, and we tend to gravitate toward things that we're familiar with. Eyes always have this very possessive or have this big control in photos because your tendency to look and make eye contact with a photo is greater than when you're talking to a person. A lot of people avoid eye contact, but when we're looking at photos, paintings, works of art where the figure or the human form is in there, we like to look at eyes. It's a very topical thing. So keeping them in the top third of it brings power to the subject of what we're taking, brings more balance to the physical photo, and it gives our eyes a starting point to start with. If we look at his eyes, we're then going to break, and we might notice his curls, and the color in between his curls and how the shade cuts. From his eyes, we might start to look down at the pink shirt, and we might start to see kind of the shadows and the dipping in and out of color and the saturation. Or we might just look at him as a whole and start to blur out that background, which is already being blurred out naturally through the camera. So again, eyes in the top third of the photo, it helps bring a little bit more power. Lastly, focus on the eyes. I just said it 3 different times, but you can see the color and the variation of color within her eyes. You can also see that negative space as a whole has been cut off of this image, and you don't get a lot of the riffraff because you don't need it inside the image. And the last thing too is that her eyes are on the top third of the page. So we're seeing just something kind of more common as we look through. I promise I didn't pick these images up specifically to then match each other. That's just kind of what you'll naturally start to see photographers do in order to get a better image. Now, getting on their level, when I talk about this, I usually refer to kids or to anybody that's smaller, even if you've got pets or dogs. That downward shot that we take of people sometimes can feel like a hierarchy scale. And I think of like, I think of you got the king, you've then got the king's servants underneath them, and then you've got their knights, you've got their noblemen, and then you've got the peasants. When you kind of look at that triangular hierarchy scale or that pyramid scale, you start to notice that you're looking down further and further that you go. And so by doing that, you're giving them less power. You're giving them less significance. In a sense, with this image, you're maybe just trying to capture the whole group, and while that looks great and might be perfect for the moment, there also could be a little bit more that we can do on that one. We can try to first get on their level. So taking a picture where, again, where are the eyes at? Eyes are, for the most part, in the top third. I would say his eyes on the top and then the other eye is kind of the middle line. But it makes a cleaner photo as a whole. You got the brother and the sister at the birthday party. This looks more professional. This might be something that you hang above the fireplace or put in a frame before Christmas to show off to the family. It has more pizzazz to it, more focus on there too, nice color saturation. It was done a little bit with more thought or detail than necessarily this one was done with.
Having a bigger nose, if you shoot down, you elongate people's noses.
That's true. Depending on the level, or depending on the camera that you have, or lens that you have too. If you have a 50mm lens, there should be less happening with that. But if you've got a tighter lens, let's say now up to 75, 150, and then they start to bend, yeah, of course, it's going to make their nose big schnoz. The other thing too is get lower than them as well too. So if you can put the subject matter at a higher level than where you're shooting from, you shoot from an upwards angle, you're giving then the photo or the person in the photo or the subject in the photo more power. The viewer is then within that setting or within that, I would say, kind of glance or view. It also helps the height differential. If you think about it, these kids are probably between the ages of 5 to 8, maybe 10 years old at the best. They're going to be no taller than this. So again, shooting a kid from this angle versus getting low and shooting them from above, you're giving them a little bit more power, a little bit more thought. The rule of thirds then comes into this. Now, the rule of thirds within photography is that you can divide a photograph into 9 different sections. You've got a section going this way, so top, middle, and bottom. You've also got a section going from right, middle to left. In between all of that, we then have points of contact, where our lines intersect. That is going to be the sweet spot within the rule of thirds. That's where we're hitting at different parameters that are more intriguing to the eyes. There's another term within painting. It's a big like swivel that kind of cuts around. It's a big spiral pattern. that if you can find a way to fit that spiral pattern into your work of art, it is more likely to be viewed by more people if they were to see it. I know the science behind it sounds really goofy, but it's just through how humans interact with artwork and interact with things around them. So my examples for that, I'm going to warn you now, it's a lot of surfers, a lot of beach photos. So the first thing I got for you is another word I'm going to add into it, a horizon line. Horizon line is going to be where your background and your foreground connect, and everything that's on the foreground then becomes something that we can see. So we can see everything that's in front of us. But when we get to that horizon line in the background, now things need to be on top of that. And that's a goofy way of looking at it from a painter or a drawer standpoint, but when we look at it a photography standpoint, if we can keep horizon lines or these significant lines within a straight line, even with our picture frame, and it's really cool that cameras nowadays have that capability to have the leveler as you're shooting. But if you turn that off and that's not something you use, think of your rule of thirds in this case. Our horizon line is almost perfect with this top third. That's number one. Number two, though, where we're really mainly concerned are those intersecting points on our physical rule of third. And we're hitting both of those points with our surfer dude right there in the middle. His body is against the sun, so the sun is behind his back. And the way that the shadow is then casting from there is it puts it directly underneath him with a beautiful ray of light coming between his legs that offers a really nice shine from the water. So overall, it's a more satisfying image because we have all of this space to tell us what's happening in the scene, but we have our main subject matter within the rule of thirds. Another beach photography one. So in this case, the line is perfect right now. It is right on the horizon line, so we have good foreground to background separation, or good foreground to background meeting. Now it's a little bit overcast and it's a black and white photo. But in my opinion, when you see the lights breaking through, they break through the clouds right here. And they're hitting this area. So we've got good illumination kind of cutting across this whole beach, even though it's black and white photography. On top of that too, the little girl's shoulder and her ankle are hitting on that line, and we have this beautiful seascape going across. Now, one thing you can say is that we're breaking the rule number one that we just talked about, which was to fill up the space and crop as much as possible. But for whatever reason, maybe to add dramaticism, to make it a little bit more moody, you adding that rest of that background into the image just maybe amplifies the point a little bit harder. Who cares that this little girl is looking out into the water? But at the same time, we might care more given the fact that we see the context of what she's looking at. This very solemn, open water with no boats, nothing on the harbor, a little bit of seaweed on the floor, so there's kind of not decay, but like random stuff everywhere. It has a little bit of a grittiness to it. And that might be attractive to what we're trying to capture in the moment of our photo taking. You got mom and dad, brother and sister. Now in this case, we can't see a horizon line in the background, so we have no clue where the horizon, where the foreground and the background meet. But what we do have are converging lines. When we look at things like the windows, and we look at the wall and the ceiling over here, and even where the siding on the building changes color, we can see that they're all coming in at a point. And we can call that one-point perspective, where there's a point somewhere on there, and naturally with our human eyes, we can start to see everything converging at one point. If you got time when you go home today, stand in the middle of your street and look down your block. And as you keep looking down the block, you'll notice that the sidewalks, the street, and everything else get narrow to a point. And that's that one-point perspective that our eyes are naturally seeing as we look. Besides that point, though, where our intersecting points come into play, we are hitting those marks perfectly. My only complaint on this image is that I wish that mom and dad could step over a little bit more so they were perfectly in the center, just like brother and sister were. But the point's there. You add this little bit of hierarchy scale too because you're shooting upwards. You can tell that brother and sister, or the son and the daughter, are smaller. Therefore, putting their parents in the back, they can change that height size up a little bit and bring in a little bit more fun to the family photo, or maybe a little bit more dramaticism, if you will. And this is my funny image that I like to throw in there. This breaks the rule that I talk about in the very beginning where I say crop out the negative space and fill your page as best as you can with the main subject matter. By putting Jim from The Office on the right side of the screen there, he's crossing and hitting our points. And if you ever watch The Office, this is how they film it every single time they do these little interview scenes. They always have the person slightly off center of the camera, and they're getting a little bit of the background with it too. And the reason being is that they're able to show you exactly where this person is without giving any extra context to it. If you've watched the show, you know he's in the conference room when they're interviewing him, talking to him, so they have that look to it. And again, all rules are meant to be broken. Do you have to put somebody on the rule of thirds? Absolutely not. When I take pictures on my cell phone, I actually keep this grid up at all times. That's to help me with my positioning of subjects. But when I'm shooting on my regular camera, in my mind I picture my rule of thirds and I decide if I need it or don't need it. One of the last things I talk about in the class is sun on your back. So for a lot of people when you're shooting, the tendency of keeping light away or being being not afraid of light, but being wary of the light is big. And I think that for most people, because they shoot in the digital world, they don't remember film being so sensitive to light. It is so important to understand that your camera can only function because there is light in the sky or light in the studio or whatever it is that you're doing. If you shoot a camera in a pitch black room, it's going to be a pitch black image. So you need light. Keeping light behind or not on the subject matter doesn't really help our situation. In this case, we have the gentleman on the top with our little bad term over on the side there. He's closed off to us. We don't see the fish, or we see the front of the fish, but we don't see his face. His hat is crooked a little bit on the top. You can see the sunlight coming in on his his outer thigh there. But overall, there's not a lot of illumination onto this. He's not opening himself up. In the next image, the fish itself has a slime to it. It has shells to, or scales to it. It has a good amount of light that can bounce off of it. He opens his shoulder up slightly and moves his head to the side. He cocks his head back a little bit more with his hat, and naturally that light comes in and can reflect off the fish, hitting his face a little bit more. But then also you can see the bottom of the boat illuminates it more, and so does the sides of his legs and hands. The parts that are still dark are his shoulders, where that arm is hitting on the one side there, and then underneath his feet we still have that little bit of shadow there. So it's that slight adjustment of just repositioning yourself to work with the sun to optimize your photos. We can always make a photo darker later on. It's harder to make a photo lighter later on. So keep that in mind. And the last thing I talk about before I mention a couple accessories I think you all can get would be using your timer and camera app. While I agree and think that your phone as a whole is, while I think that it's not always the best to use it because it drains the battery of your camera much faster, you can really do some amazing stuff on there. Some of the apps allow for, or all of the apps should allow for a timer setting, where you can physically walk over, remote control the camera, and then choose when you want to take that picture. That's a really nice feature on there. Other things too include the transfer of your photos. You're really able to transfer a lot of your photos from your camera to your phone. My downside of doing that is you will diminish the quality of the image slightly, but you also will drain your battery life like crazy. But it is cool, like let's say you're on vacation and you've got 10 beautiful photos and you're like, I want to show the wife what I just got to see, or let my kids know I'm safe, or what have you. You can take 15, 20 photos, send them to your phone with little to no problems. If you're trying to send 50 to 100 photos, or more than I'd say more than 20 photos from your phone to your camera to your phone, that's where you definitely want to think about that a little bit more, because you're draining that battery real quick. Some of these apps too have editing software built into them where you can change the telephoto zoom, you can crop in, you can update things like your white balance or your tint or shade. You can do basically all of the editing things that you can do on an Adobe program right through your phone. So that's also really cool with using these apps. Now, last thing I do talk about on here, and I completely forgot, is content creation. This doesn't necessarily pertain to everybody. But for a lot of people, I would say nowadays we want not only to take photos, but we want to be able to take good videos as well too. So when we're talking about video quality, I have a friend of mine who they have a fashion brand that they're working on, and the way that they capture their images is with a 2002 camcorder. The reason they do that is because it fits whatever the vibe is for their brand, what they're going for. Is it the most pristine image that your Canon or Nikon is going to get? Absolutely not. But does it work for them? Yes. So make sure that you're using whatever it is for you, you're using proper lenses to capture what you want. And you're using a proper camera body and you're setting those to be proper. Again, reading online, looking things up to make sure you're using your camera for your needs is important. Have proper stabilization. If you have a shaky hand or you're not good at holding things, look at getting a tripod, look at getting a gimbal, look at something that can help you not have such a shaky or tough time getting it done. Lighting is always important, like we talked about earlier. Natural lighting is always going to be king as long as you've got non-overcloudy days, but you can even buy on-camera lights like flashes or light cubes, and studio lighting if you really want to get into it. I always use this room for example. You've got recessed can lighting in my ceiling over here that gives a nice moody, shadowy room. As a whole though, if you wanted to take really nice photos in here, you're probably not going to get the most lit up or beautiful photos. So, another thing. Microphones. Your camera has a microphone built into it. It is the worst microphone that you can get. That's just the truth. There's no way of kidding around that. The camera companies focus so much on making sure that the optics and the lenses and the screen and everything else is beautiful, they could really care less about the microphone. They know that if you're really serious about making videos, you're going to invest in something like a shotgun mic or an on-camera microphone or even a wireless microphone too in the future. So those are great ways of checking yourself. If you are doing video and more of that, make sure your video quality is what you need. Make sure stabilization is good, lighting, and then obviously the sound is important too. Those are all important factors to get started. And for a lot of people, just buying a content creation kit is more than enough. Some of these kits will have everything you need to get started, like a little tripod, a microphone, and a remote. Others will come with the physical camera, a microphone, a remote, a tripod, and other ones too, like Sony's, will give you just a little grip and then an SD card so that way you have enough to get started. So again, everyone's a little bit differently. You can piece it all together, but you can also just get everything separately and kind of move from there. Last thing I'll talk about, and then I believe that's all I got for the class today, is my recommended accessories list. If you are brand new to this, I think that the top 4 of my list are must-haves. You absolutely need a bag. I don't care what anybody says. If you're traveling, you're going somewhere, it's really important to make sure your camera is safe and protected. You should be disassembling your lenses if you're getting on an airplane, because if you have your camera attached to the lens, you're putting it at greater risk to get smashed or for the bayonet to snap. So that's important. Have an extra battery. Again, if you're experiencing that the way that you're taking photos and the settings that you have turned on are draining your batteries faster than other times, have 2 batteries. My example for that is I was at Arlington Cemetery, and I had a really great time while I was out there. I had just taken pictures of the Potomac. I was over in the, where was I at before that? I was in a few different locations, but I was taking pictures of the Potomac, and basically I get into Arlington Cemetery, I get to see the changing of the guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. 3 photos in, my battery died. And I'm like, well, that's awful. So I had to go back to my hotel room, get another battery, and then come back. In the meantime from that, I wasted about an hour and a half of my time when I could have just been taking photos. So carry 2 batteries with you. You won't regret it. Have that extra memory card in case you lose one or in case one doesn't work inside your camera. Easier to have an extra one than not to have an extra one. A lens cleaning kit, I feel like that's a necessity at this point. One of the events that I shoot is the Chicago Polar Plunge, and every year I'm in the water taking pictures. People splash water at me while they're doing that naturally. So when I'm taking pictures of them, if I don't have a cleaning cloth to wipe that away, I'm going to get blurry or just ugly looking photos. So having a kit to clean it, just in case a bug flies into your camera get a little bit of water there, never use your t-shirt. I don't care if you have a lens filter on there or not, never use a t-shirt, never use a sweater, use a microfiber cloth. That's what they were made for. They're built for that. They're smooth cloths that don't leave residue or scratches. And a strap. I think you should always have a neck strap around your camera. That's just for the ease of carrying it around. But you can then get a tripod, get external hard drives if that's the route that you want to go with, various filters and additional lenses, which we'll talk more about lenses next week too. But my biggest recommendation is classes and workshops. Anybody who's a photographer or is getting into this hobby, you're a forever student. There's always going to be something new to learn. There's always going to be a new toy that comes out, a better lens. Go online, do online classes. They have them for free out there. Join groups. I used to have plenty of people that would come to the class that were part of the O'Hare Club. They had special permission to be on the O'Hare runway to shoot the planes as they land and take off. I have a few people that go to the Botanic Gardens, and they're part of their club, and they do beautiful photos. And they actually have competitions for their photos. Whoever wins actually gets to be the magazine cover for that month at the Botanic Garden for their newsletter. I think that's really cool. So there's really awesome things that you can get a part of to become more familiar with your camera. If just taking photos around your home or of your family or of your loved ones isn't enough for you, there's always something more to do. And the last thing I'll leave you, the last thing I'll leave you on. The bitterness of poor quality remains long after the sweetness of a low price is forgotten. Get a deal when you can get a deal. I'll never tell you no on a good deal, but photography is one of the hardest art forms because at the end of the day, the more money you invest into your equipment, the better you're going to get results from. So if you buy the cheapest camera and you're sitting there and going, I don't understand why it's not X, Y, Z, it's not, in that case, it might not be the baseball player, it might be the bat in that case. But in the time, if you can get a good deal on an SD card or maybe a lens that you're looking at, great. But if it comes down to, okay, do I buy this one lens for $100 or this lens for $1,000, realize that the $1,000 lens is going to have the kicker.
One of my favorites.
Exactly, but at what cost? Exactly.
Sorry to interrupt, but
You're fine.
that's
No.
one of my favorites.
No, it's true. It's true.
That's something.
Exactly. So that's one of my favorite quotes out of this one. This was when I first started teaching this class. They gave me the PowerPoint presentation, and this was in there. And I really liked this quote because it made sense to me as a photographer. You get a lot of good deals out there, a lot of times where you can save money, but just kind of always weigh that option because it doesn't necessarily mean that buying a used lens is a bad thing. But if you see a lens is $200 and you see another lens is $1,000, why is that one lens $1,000? That's what you should be asking yourself, and at least get to experience that quality so that it translates more. And that is all I have for you today. So next week is going to be my intermediate class. That's the next Thursday of the month. My phone number, email are on there too, so take a picture, call me, email me anytime if you got questions. Anybody online too watching, what I always recommend is if there's something that comes up with your camera or a photo that you took and you're like, I don't understand why it looks this way, take a picture of it, email that to me, and that usually is a better jumping off point so I can kind of figure out what's going on. So,
Cool.
but yeah, any questions from you guys?
Sorry to have interrupted your lecture with that picture.
Don't ever be sorry.
Okay, I do have a question.
What you got?
We were talking about the manual focus, and I know on ParentStat where you can have autofocus, manual, or. I don't know the problem with this lens, but I did pick up the Tamron, and it's like, do not touch the focus.
Interesting.
This focuses automatically. Don't stop it. You will ruin the lens. So I was
Okay.
just curious.
That shouldn't be the case. I'd have to physically see it, the Tamron, but in my experience, no, because the camera itself dictates how you're controlling it. And so if you're turning manual focus on that lens, then what's going to happen is that the camera, when you try to
But then I have to switch it here, right?
Exactly, that's where you switch it.
Okay.
Exactly.
So in other words, as long as you switch it, then
Yeah, then it's it. Because if you have it on manual focus and then you try to focus with that Tamron, it's not going to focus. It's not going to
Okay.
do anything. But once you start moving that focus meter or focus ring, and as long as the lens has the focus ring on there, that's exactly why it has that ring.
Okay.
The reason that that might have come up in conversation is if you are on autofocus and you start playing with that ring, you'll feel resistance. You'll feel like it doesn't want to move with you, and that's because you have it connected to the camera body. The camera body is sensing for light and doing all of that in there, so it doesn't necessarily want you to change that. The camera's doing the work for you. So there should be no issue.
So for instance, at a zoo when there's an animal and the camera just has to focus on the fence instead of the animal.
Yeah, that's
Go to
right.
manual.
Yeah, go to manual.
Okay.
Or change what your focusing area is. If you've got a medium or wide focusing area, try to bring it into a single point.
I had the single point, but it
Still kept going for the fence.
it keeps flipping back and forth.
Yeah.
So you think you have it,
Manual.
and then you don't.
Go
Okay.
manual for that. A fence is a good option there. Where if you're seeing that on there, you're probably going to benefit from that.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure, and I always leave the eyes on this are better than mine.
I understand.
And I will ask. Can I ask one more? Do you have any questions? I don't wanna.
No.
No question.
I don't wanna.
No issue. If you have nothing, don't worry about it. If you think of something later on, bother me. What other question you have?
Okay. I don't know about the Panasonic yet. I haven't gone through everything. On Nikon, it has SnapRidge. I will click on a couple pictures that I want to transfer, and all of a sudden I find it is transferred a ton more. I don't know how to get it to only transfer when I want it to.
It shouldn't be as simple as just selecting those three and then hitting transfer. There might be two buttons on the bottom there where it says transfer all and just transfer. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe that could be an option.
Well, I think maybe SnapRidge is the one that just goes everything instead of just a transfer, but I don't.
It shouldn't.
I'll look at it again because
Look
it's
at it.
happened to me twice.
Look at it again. Give it a shot. If not, I'd say we'll try it out. We can then go through it and see how that works and just play with it. I personally haven't used SnapRidge because I don't shoot on Nikon myself. But
now I only have.
yeah, with Fuji and with Sony, which are my two preferred brands, when I use their app to download my images on my camera, I just select maybe the 2-3 images that I want, 10 images that I want, hit the transfer, and it only schleps those 10 over. It doesn't bother with the rest of them. So it could be just something simply that you're missing on there while you're going with it, but it also could be something that I'm not thinking of. So. Anything else from you guys?
I'm good.
Awesome.
I feel like I keep interrupting, and I do apologize again when you were lecturing to show you that.
You're
but-
totally fine.
I was at a place and everyone would go, but I can get it cheaper.
Yeah.
I'm like,
I have a lot of friends that did that. As an artist myself, when I paint and I draw and I do other things, when I talk to people about my artwork and I show it to them, they, I tell them, how much I would charge for a painting like this, and they look at me like I'm nuts, and I'm like, well, think about that. It's not just the time. It's not just the time it took me to make this. It's the time that I learned in schooling. It's the hours of painting that I've done by myself for no money. It's the time that I took to understand anatomy or whatever it is, my subject matter, whether it's landscape or lighting or dark and shadows. It took me a while to figure this all out. So you're not just paying for the maybe 3-4 hours it took me to paint this. You're paying for the 10,000 hours of practice that I put into getting there. Same thing with the tattoo picture. Same thing with the with the camera stuff. You get out of it what you put into it, and if you invest and you buy, I love Canon. Canon makes one of the cheapest DSLRs on the market right now. That's the Rebel T7. The Rebel T7 is a great introductory camera. When I get a college kid or a high school kid in and they're like, my mom said I could buy a camera, what do I get? I point them to that. Cheapest one I think is $329. The most expensive one's $550. $550, you get a bag, 2 lenses in the camera. That is a great deal for starting off. Now, you tell me that you are about to take wedding photography and that you just got hired to do a professional shoot, and that's the camera you want to use. I have questions. I want to know how you got there. So, again, it's one of those things where, it really does come down to that. So I agree.
the other thing you should tell people is, can they do the same thing that you did for less money?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, no, that's the key. Yeah. Good stuff. It doesn't look like anybody online is chatting or asking questions, so I'll probably just end it there. Thank you everybody for showing up. Thanks for being here, and I will see everybody next week for intermediate cameras. If anything comes up, give me a call or shoot me an email. And as always,